He painted the most famous face in history. He designed flying machines 3 centuries before the Wright brothers. He dissected 30 human bodies to understand anatomy no surgeon of his era could match. Leonardo da Vinci, born in 1452, died in 1519. The man whose name became synonymous with genius itself. But Leonardo left no descendants. He never married. He had no children. When he died in Amboise, France, his bloodline, as far as the world knew, died with him. Except it didn't, because Leonardo had a father who had at least 17 other children, and in 2023, a research team traced that family line across 21 generations to find Leonardo's living relatives and build the foundation for sequencing his DNA. The Leonardo DNA project didn't just find his relatives. It exposed the secret that sat at the center of his life from the day he was born. Leonardo was illegitimate, and that status shaped everything. The first piece of evidence is the family tree itself, and it took historians over a century to complete. Leonardo was the firstborn son of Ser Piero da Vinci, a prominent Florentine notary, and Caterina, a young peasant woman. They never married. Leonardo was raised partly by his father's family, but was legally excluded from inheriting the family notary practice. Ser Piero would go on to marry 4 times and father at least 17 legitimate children. Leonardo's half-siblings and their descendants multiplied across the centuries, while Leonardo's own genetic line ended with him. Alessandro Vizzosi and Agni Sabato spent decades reconstructing the complete Da Vinci genealogy. Their work, published in Human Evolution in 2023, traced an unbroken male line from Leonardo's father through 21 generations to 14 living descendants. 14 men alive today who carry the same Y chromosome that Ser Piero carried, and that Leonardo carried. The chromosome passes from father to son virtually unchanged. Leonardo shared it with his father and his half-brothers. The second piece of evidence is the Y chromosome profile itself, and it connects 14 modern men to a 15th century genius. The living descendants were tested. Their Y chromosomes matched, confirming the genealogical chain. They all carry the same patrilineal genetic signature that has been passed down since at least the 1400s. Leonardo couldn't pass it on. He had no sons, but his half-brothers did, and their descendants now provide the genetic reference point for identifying Leonardo's own remains. The Y chromosome profile is the key. If DNA can ever be extracted from Leonardo's presumed burial site, the Y chromosome is what confirms or denies the identification. The third piece of evidence is the problem, because Leonardo's remains may not be Leonardo's remains. Leonardo died at the Château du Clos Luc, near Amboise on May 2, 1519. He was buried in the Collegiate Church of St. Florentin within the castle grounds, as he requested. But during the French Revolution, the church was demolished. The graves were dug up. Bones were scattered across the grounds. By the time anyone thought to recover Leonardo's remains, the site had been destroyed for decades. In 1863, a Arsini Housai conducted an excavation and selected a skeleton based on a large skull, scattered fragments of a stone inscription mentioning Leonardo's name, and wishful thinking. These remains were reinterred in the chapel of St. Hubert. The identification was circumstantial at best. No DNA testing, no forensic analysis. A skeleton selected from disturbed ground because it had a big skull. The remains in the chapel of St. Hubert may or may not be Leonardo's. The fourth piece of evidence is the plan to resolve the question. The Leonardo DNA project brings together geneticists, genealogists, historians, and microbiologists in a single coordinated effort. The project, coordinated by Jesse Ausubel at Rockefeller University, plans to extract DNA from the Amboise remains and compare it to the confirmed Y chromosome profile from living descendants. But they're also pursuing a second path. Leonardo handled his notebooks and paintings extensively over decades. His fingerprints survive on many works, and where there are fingerprints, there may be skin cells. Where there are skin cells, there may be DNA. Researchers have identified biological deposits on Leonardo's drawings using non-invasive imaging techniques. Bacteria, fungi, and human cellular material embedded in the paper from 5 centuries of handling. 3 independent lines of evidence. If 2 or more converge, Y chromosome from descendants matching remains, matching traces on the artworks, the identification becomes definitive. The 5th piece of evidence isn't genetic, it is historical. because Leonardo's illegitimate birth wasn't just a biographical detail. It was the defining constraint of his life. In 15th century Florence, illegitimate sons could not join most professional guilds. They could not inherit their father's practice. They could not attend university. Leonardo was barred from becoming a notary like his father, a lawyer, or a physician. He was pushed toward the visual arts, one of the few respected professions open to illegitimate sons. His apprenticeship with Verrocchio at age 14 wasn't a choice born of talent alone. It was one of the only doors open to him. His later obsession with engineering, anatomy, geology, and military design, fields without guild restrictions, may have been driven partly by the same exclusion. The guilds locked him out, so he went where no guild controlled access. When his father died in 1504, Ser Piero's legitimate sons fought to exclude Leonardo from any inheritance. Leonardo contested the will. He lost. The man whose intellect surpassed every legitimate sibling couldn't claim a single coin from his father's estate. The accident of birth that denied him inheritance may have created the conditions for universal genius. The DNA project won't prove that, but it traces the family line that made Leonardo both an outsider and an immortal. But here is the twist. The DNA project may never identify Leonardo, and that limitation reveals something important about the limits of ancient DNA. If the remains at Amboy don't match the family Y chromosome, that proves they aren't Leonardo. But it doesn't tell us where the real Leonardo is. His bones could be scattered across the former church grounds, mixed with dozens of other burials, or lost entirely. And if the remains do match, the identification still isn't conclusive. Any male-line Da Vinci descendant who died near Amboise could produce the same Y chromosome result. The Y chromosome identifies a family, not an individual. Autosomal DNA, the full genome, would narrow the identification further. But extracting viable ancient DNA from remains that were dug up, scattered, reburied, and handled by 19th century excavators is extraordinarily challenging. The same limitation that complicated every other case in this series. DNA identifies lineages. It doesn't always identify individuals. Leonardo may remain unidentifiable at the individual level even after sequencing. The twist is that we might have 14 living relatives, a confirmed Y chromosome profile, biological traces on his artworks, and still never prove which bones and amboses are his. DNA can answer the question, but the French Revolution may have destroyed the evidence before the question could be asked. The first case study pursues the other half of Leonardo's DNA, the side nobody talks about. Leonardo's mother, Caterina, was long identified as a local peasant girl. But in 2017, historian Martin Kemp and researcher Carlo Vexi presented evidence suggesting she may have been an enslaved woman, possibly of Circassian or Middle Eastern origin. Slavery in 15th century Florence was common among wealthy households. Enslaved people were brought from the Eastern Mediterranean, the Caucasus, and North Africa. If Caterina was enslaved, Leonardo was not just illegitimate but of mixed heritage. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited exclusively from the mother, could settle the question. If Leonardo's remains yield viable moti DNA, it would reveal whether his maternal line was local European or from the Caucasus or Middle East. The second case study asks whether Leonardo's genome could explain any of his unusual traits. Leonardo was left-handed. He wrote in mirror script. Some scholars have proposed dyslexia. He demonstrated extraordinary visual processing. His observations of water flow, wing mechanics, and anatomical detail suggest unusual perceptual ability. Could his genome explain any of this? Beethoven's couldn't explain his music, but Leonardo's traits are more specific. Handedness, visual processing, and the arm paralysis described in his final years all have known genetic associations. If viable DNA is ever recovered, researchers could screen for variants associated with left-handedness, spatial cognition, and the ulnar nerve palsy that may have affected his painting in later life. But as with Beethoven, the genome is unlikely to explain genius. It may explain handedness. It may confirm a neurological condition. It will not contain the blueprint for the Mona Lisa. The third case study is the most innovative, extracting DNA not from a body but from a painting. In 2020, researchers published analysis of the biological material embedded in 7 of Leonardo's drawings. Using nanopore DNA sequencing, they identified human, bacterial and fungal DNA trapped in the paper. The human DNA on the drawings represents everyone who ever touched them. Leonardo, his students, later collectors, museum staff. Separating Leonardo's DNA from centuries of contamination is the challenge. But if the Y chromosome from the drawings matches the Y chromosome from living descendants, the identification strengthens. The artwork becomes the DNA source. The paper becomes the coffin that preserved his molecules. 3 case studies. A mother whose identity could rewrite Leonardo's heritage. A genome that may explain some traits but not genius. And artwork that preserved DNA the grave may have lost. The molecules are scattered across paintings, notebooks, a disputed grave, and 14 living men in Tuscany. The challenge isn't finding the DNA, it is assembling it. So what does Leonardo's DNA project actually tell us, even before the genome is complete? That the most celebrated mind in Western history was born into the one category 15th century Florence valued least: illegitimate, excluded, legally invisible to the profession his family practiced, and that the exclusion pushed him sideways, into the arts, into engineering, into anatomy, into every discipline that didn't require legitimate birth to enter. His DNA will eventually reveal his ancestry. It may confirm or deny whether his mother was enslaved. It will place him in the genetic landscape of 15th century Italy, but it won't explain the drawings. It won't explain the Mona Lisa. It won't explain why one illegitimate boy in a Tuscan hill town became the archetype of human potential. His father gave him a Y chromosome. Florence gave him nothing. He gave the world everything. His presumed bones rest in a small chapel in France. His confirmed DNA lives in 14 men in Italy. His fingerprints survive on paper in museums across Europe. Somewhere between the grave, the living, and the art, the molecules of Leonardo da Vinci wait to be assembled into a complete sequence. The evidence file is open. 5 lines of investigation, family confirmed, remains disputed. DNA scattered across 5 centuries of art and bone, and one man whose illegitimate birth excluded him from his father's profession and redirected him toward immortality. The DNA project continues. The genome may arrive next year or next decade, but the genealogy is already complete. 21 generations from a Tuscan notary to 14 men carrying his Y chromosome today. But Leonardo isn't the only genius whose DNA is being hunted across centuries of art and bone. Across European museums and archives, the biological traces of the celebrated dead are being cataloged for future extraction. And the technology improves every year. Samples too degraded for today's sequencers may yield complete genomes within a decade. If Leonardo's fingerprints contain his genome, whose else do? How many masterpieces are also molecular time capsules? Which painting holds the DNA of its painter? Which manuscript preserves the genome of its author? Every page Leonardo touched carries a trace of the man who touched it. The art preserved the artist in a way no grave could guarantee. If this investigation changed what you thought you knew, subscribe. Every case in this series follows the same rule. Start with the textbook, follow the DNA, and let the molecules speak for themselves. Leonardo lived 67 years. His Y chromosome has survived 506. His genome may survive on the paper he touched. All sources and peer-reviewed references are linked in the description below. The question isn't whether we can find Leonardo's DNA. It is scattered across 3 countries. The question is whether anyone in 1519 imagined that a fingerprint on a notebook would outlast the grave. And that is a question Leonardo, the man who studied everything, might have found fascinating. His art preserved his mind. His art may also have preserved his molecules.